Hi.
Hello, how are you?
Fine, and you?
I'm good, I'm good. Are you having a nice day?
No, nice to meet you.
Likewise.
Quite day, yeah. Quite working day. And you?
So far so good. Never a dull moment here. Where are you?
I'm in Paris. I'm in 18th arrondissement of Paris, near the Butte Montmartre, in
Oh
my
wow.
apartment. And where are you at?
I'm in Brooklyn, New York. Kind of the center of the kind of nearby the center of the pandemic in the United States. So
Yeah, yeah. So you confined you stay at home?
pretty much entirely, yes. Where we
Yeah.
are, there's just a lot of virus around, and so pretty much everybody who can is working from home, and so our days are pretty much entirely spent inside right now. How about yourself?
Yeah, me too. For since the middle of March, so 4 weeks, more than 4 weeks, and 4 weeks again. So it becomes an habit, and it was quite complicated the first times, but nowadays it's well, we got used to it. So it's a very strange time and very strange situation. So in Paris when we can get out for an hour, but the streets are almost empty and the streets are very sad because they are not conceived to be empty. So the landscape is too great for it's too big for people.
No, it's funny. I feel the same way. I'm here with my girlfriend, and we've been very, very good, very safe. Except the other morning, very, very early, we had one risky moment where we went on a bike ride, which we hadn't done. We really hadn't been around, but we rented the city bikes, the bikes you can just rent for an hour here,
Yeah.
and there was nobody out. We wiped down the bikes as much as we can. We had masks and goggles and everything, and we just rode around. And it was so tragic. It was so bittersweet because on one hand, we saw the life. I mean, our former life was just still there. You know, all of our restaurants and cafes and everything were still there. But it was like almost a nightmare in a way because it was like empty of people, and all the structures didn't make any sense. You know, there's no reason to have those structures if there aren't people there enjoying them. I agree with you.
Yeah, completely. And you could imagine that Paris could be beautiful without people because you can see the monuments, etc. And it's awful. It's awful without tourists and without the Parisians. It's just a dream for police because police cars are running through the streets, and you feel that they are very happy of the situation because they have the whole city for themselves.
Did you
Uh,
say that it's sad without tourists?
yeah, I think so. I, I miss them. I really miss them.
Until they come back, and then
Yeah. So what you do for living?
sure. So I'm a professor at a university called Vanderbilt University in the United
Yeah.
States. Um, and I'm the director of a program called the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society. So we study healthcare and the world, healthcare and society and politics. Um, we and so I do that, and then I also write books for a living. So like you, as hard as it's been to not get my inspiration from the outside world, I also write books. My last book was a book called Dying of Whiteness that looked at the ways that many white Americans are making their decisions about politics based on racism, basically, and not so much on public health, which I think is becoming a big risk factor in the world right now in terms of just the way the United States is dealing with this. How about yourself?
Oh, uh, I was a professor. I studied and I taught philosophy, and I wrote books about philosophy, mostly on contemporary philosophy, I'm a specialist of Michel Foucault, which is very common in the United States, but not so much in France because when I started to work on Foucault in the 90s, there were very few people working on his work. In the academic field, many people were relieved by its death. You know, it was away and it was good. So it's quite interesting to read Foucault these days. And I decided to quit the academic field a few years ago, or to stay away the academic field, to do something else. And nowadays I run the public programs at the Centre Pompidou in Paris. You know, I'm in charge of concerts and dance and cinemas and talks, performing arts and mixing things together. And it's very, very sad for me these days because it's a very important moment. There are many things to consider, many issues to address, and I don't have my beautiful tool to do that because the center is closed and nobody knows when the museum will reopen and when we'll be allowed to gather an audience in the rooms. So we wait to do all the things that we could imagine around this situation and around this crisis. You know, it's very.
What kinds of work are you doing in the meantime?
Well, I try to prepare things for next fall, even if I don't know if we'll be in capacity of organize things in fall. Some people say that we'll reopen in fall. Some people say that we won't reopen until 21. So it's atmospheric moments when you imagine things, even if you know that you don't know if they be possible. And I write also. I try to write. I try to think about what's happening. And as you know, Foucault wrote a lot about biopolitics and the link between biology and politics. But so there are many commentaries on biopolitics nowadays, but most of them are very I don't know how to say, very quick to give big picture and to explain how all this crisis is a way to control bodies, etc. And it's quite simple and not very interesting. So I try to reread the text to complicate a little this way of seeing and this way of using the concept of biopolitics in these times, you know, because I think it's which is interesting. It's that it's, but I'd like to hear you in this situation. It's entirely a medical crisis and entirely a political crisis.
Yeah, it's mostly a political crisis right now. I mean, of course, it's a medical crisis also, but it's also, I mean, what we're seeing in the United States, I study race.
Yeah.
And what we're seeing in the United States is that the ways that the illness is playing out, the ways that the virus is spreading, the vectors of violence, the vectors of the virus are completely illuminating and expanding the social ruptures that were already present in the country. One of those is about race. So we're seeing that people who are low income and minority are suffering disproportionate amounts of death. And so partially it's highlighting the profound racial and economic disparities in our country. And the virus is showing that, but it's also showing how fractured and polarized people are, that they can't work together. I mean, the virus in so many ways is a common enemy, but because of the intense polarization in our country, polarization about race, about politics, that's being fomented by our government. It's really hampering so deeply our ability to come together. And it's really leading to a lot of philosophical discussions about what's the benefit of the American way of life. I mean, I don't think anybody's excited about wanting to go to like a dictatorship, but the fact that this polarization is so profound, it's just exacerbating the health disparities that we already had.
Yeah. Do you have all the information that you need to work? Because it's I think it's a very peculiar moment when you have at the same time many informations that you can go and see what's happening. So how do you deal with that?
I mean, my research usually is going to talk to people. You know, I also do a lot of data, a lot of analysis, but I'm trying to connect with people. One of my main research areas is on guns, firearms. And so usually I go out and I talk to people who own guns and find out how they feel. There's a big issue right now with a lot of people purchasing weapons. And, you know, it seems crazy because you can't really shoot a virus with a bullet. But there's a massive move of people buying guns right now.
Oh,
so
yeah.
I would love to be talking to people and finding out how they feel about it. It's, you know, I'm doing my best to connect to people on, you know, phone calls and stuff like that, but I can't really tell the story as broadly as I can because Zoom is wonderful. I'm very grateful for it in this time, but it also only tells you a small part of the story. And the other frustration for me is I feel like, as you know, it's wonderful. This exercise is wonderful because we should expand our networks right now. And it's hard. We're learning as a species how to do that, not just as researchers. But how do you do that when the people you're talking to often are just people you already know or people who you're already connected with on social media or something like that. So ways to broaden the network, I think, are challenging right now in a way. So how about for yourself?
As you say, it's complicated because this crisis follows a certain path. It follows the fragility map of society. But on the other side, you have many connections with your people, with your families, where I spend most of my time phoning my parents, my cousins, my etc. So it's like if two societies are separating, you know, and that this society that the media are talking about, and your society, your close, your community, in fact. Even if the concept of community is not the same use in France and the United States. So it's complicated to make a link between those two ways of getting information. I was wondering, does the fact that the virus affects elder people changes something in this polarization you're describing? Because in France, the thing is that at the same time there's this conscience of a common threat because it affects other people, and on the other hand, there are poor territories that are very affected. You see, it's not as usual because this time your grandmother is concerned, you know, and not only the immigrants or the poor people, etc. So it's changed the landscape.
You know, age is a very important aspect of this, you know, and it has been from the beginning. I think, you know, obviously we were all privy in the beginning to the same news. And so the early reports from China about this mostly not affecting people who were younger than 30 or things like that. It's just so unfortunate that that was the first news that came out, right? Because I think in a lot of research now that's turning out not exactly to be true. Of course, people who are older are more at risk, but I think in the United States, at least, it led to a lot of, and not across the board, but a lot of attitudes in younger people that were very counterproductive. I think in the beginning, because there were people partying or going on vacations or going to the beach, and it just ended up being a vector of spreading the virus. There was a kind of famous case where there was a kind of spring holiday here, and all the young people went to Florida, and then they all flew back across the country, and they think that was one of the main spreaders. So certainly, what we're seeing in New York, for example, is that half the cases now are people 45 and younger. That it's not just older people, and I think that a lot of that information, at least in the New York data so far. It wasn't just young people, right? And young people are now getting quite older people, not young people are getting sick now, quite sick. And so the question is, how does that shift? But I do think it does have implications for age, right? About ageism, how we think about people, also about the importance of social networks. I just keep thinking about in Italy, for example, where there's such a strong familiar structure, and people were putting their elderly relatives at risk by doing things that, would love them and take care of them. The other issue is, I think, about age is that we just have a very uneven healthcare system in the United States. And so elderly people, in addition to the coronavirus, they also have a number of other medical problems, right? And they can't get treatment for just their regular, heart problems or diabetes or other everyday medical problems. And so I think that the risk to elderly people right now is immense. And I think we're just starting to wake up to it, but it's hard. The question of age is very, very complicated. Do you feel that way in France also?
It's quite the same thing. And it, thing is that I think we understand with this crisis how an epidemic is not only a sickness. It's an interaction between a sickness and a medical system, and that's quite interesting because that's a Foucauldian experience. Foucault said that, things are relations, So that's why the concept of biopolitics interests me these days, to answer to our to Cedric. Cedric asks us to give a definition of biopolitics. So I will do that.
Can you say a bit more about that, about it not just being a sickness, but being an interaction? That's very interesting.
Well, I think that when this idea of flatten the curve began to spread, that what we had to do was to preserve ourselves from the virus, not only to preserve ourselves, but to preserve the capacity of the whole system to treat, to give treatment to people who need it. We realized that the things that such things as an epidemic is a complex, a relation between social, historical, cultural conditions and events and biological events, and that is quite interesting because it shows that how much biology and it's very complicated to separate biology from politics, and political problems are also medical problems, especially since politics has decided to deal with life, and that's what biopolitics means in Foucault's work. It designs this moment where politics decided to not only to give death and to execute people, but to make them live longer, and to increase the health, public health, etc. And we are in the middle of it now. And in France, there's all this debate about, the president said that it's not the time to discuss politics because it's a war and it's a medical issue. But since 3 or 4 centuries, medical issues are political problems. So let's do that. Let's discuss that.
And it's funny to think about what the implications of that are, because will that change our politics? I mean, it's interesting because in the United States, we're seeing, I think, exactly the opposite response, which is that this medical crisis has become profoundly a political crisis. The Trump administration and our government have made it very political and very polarizing in ways that I think are counter to the health of people. In other words, if you think about the ways that this virus works, right, it really, as I was saying before, it really depends on cooperation, right? You want to actually create the broadest sense of national unity that you can. And instead, the messages from our government are, attacking the press or making different states compete with each other for resources like ventilators or finances, playing to, I think, very clear kind of racial stereotypes, also exacerbating this idea that people need to get guns to protect themselves from one another. And so in a way, the response of our government has been to make this an entirely political and polarizing power grab in a particular way. And in a way, I think it's almost the opposite of what you're saying in France, which is that by overtly politicizing this, by making this not just political, but really about the American polarized political system, it's exacerbating polarizing fault lines that make it harder for us to treat this crisis at all, really, because the idea about this virus is you're not going to have a treatment in one location but not in another location. Everybody is either safe or everybody is at risk. And so the idea that any one community is safe while there's still pockets of virus around is a fantasy. It's false. And so in that regard, the overt politicization of the virus, in the United States has made us much less safe as a country, I believe.
I understand. But there's one thing interesting in what you describe is that it shows how much social distancing is a cooperative strategy, because in a way, you could think that by getting at a distance from one another, it could weaken our links and our solidarity. But you have to have a very strong sense of solidarity of community to practice social distancing. So that's a political lesson, I think.
And are there people in France who are not, they're sending us a picture now, I guess. I do want to ask a question, which is, are there people in France who are resisting the social distancing, that do not believe in that sense of the cooperative?
There are not many people, no. There are few people who are resisting the social distancing. Some Catholics, they organized a mass last Sunday, a clandestine mass, but it was quite ridiculous. There are people who don't understand social distancing. For example, elder people in my hometown, they continue to they keep on visiting each other, etc. Well, that's okay. So that's a problem. But there are philosophers who say that with social distancing, we are losing our humanity, we're losing something in our social social experience, etc. And I think the contrary. I think that by practicing things like that nowadays, it's like in the times of AIDS. In the times of AIDS, people knew that to help each other, the better they could do was to take care and be cautious. And here's the image. So we have to.
You know, I had another. I can't even see it. Let me see. I can't open that file. Let's see. I cannot open this file. Let's see.
No? Oh, it will open. Take your time.
I have to save it onto my desktop. Let's see.
Okay.
See, there we go.
But I can describe it for you.
That's okay. I think I just figured it out. Oh, terror.
So from 1 to 5, where are you?
You know, I would say I go back and forth. I'm a very active person, and I exercise a lot usually. And the fact that I'm inside, I feel like my activity level relates to how much activity I am. But it really, I don't know, I think it's not just a daily question for me. It's like minute by minute. I'm either a 1 or a 5. It really depends. You know, I keep waiting for signs of hope, and sometimes there are signs of hope in community, and there are other times there are signs of, you know, in the United States, we also have a financial crisis in addition to a medical crisis. Yeah. And so there are just so many layers of tension, and it's really, how do you deal with that? So I think that I'm always a 1 and always a 5 at the same time. How about yourself?
I don't know. In the first times, I was from 4 to 5, and because it was very disturbing and very difficult to understand. Nowadays, I should say that I'm awake, but sometimes too much awake. You know, it's difficult to read. It's difficult to concentrate on things, to focus on things, because there's always this sensation that something is going wrong, that you have to be cautious, and so that's complicated to be awake all the time. It's like in the streets, when in Paris you can go out about an hour a day, but when you are in the streets and there are other people, you are so conscious that they are there. That's frightening. Usually, being in the streets, to be in the streets, you have to forget the other people's bodies, and I don't know how we'll be able to take the subway in the future, because to take the subway you don't have to be awake. you have to be sleepy or forgetting other people's bodies, and it's impossible nowadays.
No, it really, I mean, so much of our world depends on not just primary social relations, like with your family, but secondary and tertiary, you know, just the everyday interactions that you have with people. And I think you're right that on one hand, we're dependent on, I mean, like in New York, for example, we're all dependent on the safety of each other to social distance, right? The community we're forming right now is a community of people who are trying to safeguard communal safety by staying away from each other. At the same time, staying away from each other makes you really fear other people, embodied people. So when, we try to go for a run in the morning very, very early when we can. And when you see another person, you immediately run away from them.
You have these strange moves, those curves in the landscape.
It's just a funny dance. I mean, it's such a funny dance between depending on other people and fearing other people at the same time, for your safety.
We are discussing about it for the Centre Pompidou. We are discussing with a choreograph to do something on this dance, on this cooperative dance of social distancing. It's a very interesting choreographic material, and our guests are asking us to restart, to talk about restarting.
Oh, sure, please. I think that's what we were already speaking about. So that's really, what is the role of, what is a pandemic world like, and then what is a post-pandemic world like? How many of the changes that we're seeing now are going to be lasting changes? How do you reconceptualize? I mean, really, the challenge for humanity right now is about how do you reconceptualize the everything you've ever known about social interaction for the most part. I mean, it's trauma to a trauma, an unimaginable trauma in a particular way. And and what does that mean for human connection? What does that mean for human engagement? But also, what does that mean for just practical levels? The same thing. I teach at a university. If there's still a risk of people catching the virus from each other, what does that mean for the classroom? What does that mean for the way we teach and engage other people? And so that question of restarting is really about starting over. Part of the work I do shows how the old frameworks that we used before, racism, economic disparity, they're actually incredibly unuseful for a post-pandemic world, because, as I was saying before, just the way this virus works, everybody has to be safe, everybody has to be cooperating. If that's not the case, then we're all at risk, we're all in danger. And so in a way, restarting in an optimistic sense means overturning some of the core issues that led to inequality and injustice. But what we're seeing, because everybody's so terrified, is the opposite happening. People are becoming more tribal, more fearful. So I think it's kind of a challenge for humanity about which of the old structures that feel very familiar to us but were very not useful are ones that we can get rid of to start, trusting social systems a bit more.
Yeah, I guess so. And I think it's an ethical and philosophical issue also. I wrote a book a few years ago about this particular problem. Book is the title is Recommencer. You could translate it by starting over or by once again. And because the fact that this idea of doing something once again is is such a paradox, because you have to begin, but to begin again is a contradiction, because you have to be conscious of what was before, so that's not a beginning, but that must be a beginning. If it's not a beginning, you just have to continue. So how it's possible to at the same time begin and not begin? And unfortunately, I think that humanity in such case uses amnesia. And my fear is that after this horrible crisis, things will start again as usual, and people will be very in a hurry to forget what happened and to get back to business. So because is also an economical crisis, and this contradiction between the necessity of economy to start again and our necessity to change social things and things in our political systems, etc. This contradiction is terrible.
I feel the same way. That's a beautiful way to put it, really. I mean, I keep thinking, because in the United States, of course, we have all this pressure to restart the economy. But the economy that everyone is imagining restarting is the old economy. It's the economy that generated capital and other resources by particular modes of engaging with each other. And so people just think we're just going to go back into the street. Some people are going to get sick, some people aren't, but we're just going to restart the economy. And I think hopefully over time, people are going to realize that this, whatever the new beginning is going to be, depends also on an ending of the new economy is going to be dependent on this new reality, right, in a particular way, that it's not just like we're going to go back to reopening restaurants or schools or anything like that. And so it really does it just takes a lot of creativity, but also a lot of nostalgia, because people have a hard time giving up, not just the old economy, but the old economy links to our nostalgia for the way the world was before.
Yeah, I guess so. And how you can the problem is how can you invent something in a world with it's not the same thing as before dans un monde abîmé, we should say in France. It's not a brand new world, something is broken and you won't fix it, so it could be as before.
We have one more prompt, but I was going to say before we leave this very rich topic that it does make you appreciate, people have lived through different traumas in their life, but, it just makes you think about the people. I mean, for me, at least, my father is a Holocaust survivor, and I have a lot of family who escaped different things, but, you never really understand. It's kind of like those are old time war stories that people of other generations tell, what it meant to live through the Depression, what it meant to live through the war. And it really it changes your outlook, because not just of the experience, but because of this sense that starting over takes so much bravery and courage, because you're also leaving behind this idea of who you were before. And I think that it's just such a bittersweet, it's so bittersweet. And I think just so much more empathy for war stories, survivor stories, immigration stories that we've heard.
Yeah, I think that we have to identify the stories that could help us. I think that's a very important task that we have to do, is to find the good stories, to find the stories that could be useful. That's something we did with a friend of mine, a writer, very committed in the pro-immigrant activism, because, as you know, there are many problems. Migrants have many problems in France and Europe. And we wrote a book with my friend Marie Cosnay about this particular thing, is that which stories could help us to understand differently what happens to people when they decide to quit Africa to get in Europe, and which stories they bring with them, which stories in our even in our patrimony could help us. She translates Latin poems or Greek Odysseys, and says, well, let's search in our library what could help us to understand it, to face this issue. Yeah.
And also how much we take it for granted, right? In other words, like there's this false binary between like people who are immigrants or vulnerable and people who are established and safe. And what we're realizing now is we're all connected and we're all vulnerable.
Yeah, that's true.
And so it should be a moment of empathy for those stories, because we're all, I mean, honestly, in different ways. It's not like we're all relating to it the same, but we're all vulnerable. Death is right outside everybody's doorstep right now. And again, that's the same, but it just makes you, this should be a moment of shared humanity.
Yeah. So, our last prompt is very weird. Okay, but we can skip it. So it's like as you like.
I would say that well done. Please get to the recommendations. Oh, let's get to recommendations. Yeah, mouth is great, but we only have a few more moments, so let's talk about recommendations, please.
Okay. So you begin.
I've been doing so recommendations of what we're seeing and reading and thinking. Yeah. I mean, you prompted me to want to go back and read some more Foucault right now. To be honest, Foucault is definitely not dead. There's a tension, I think, for us here. The dissociating is so bittersweet right now. In other words, we're here in our apartment in Brooklyn, and in the beginning we were watching a bunch of like movies and reading about stories about pandemics, you know,
Yeah.
to understand, and everything from, you know, books like The Plague to movies like World War Z. And it was just scary because it was like they were so correct, like they were so on the mark that it was, and then we started just associating and watching, like the whole country right now in the United States is obsessed with this show called The Tiger King, which is complete mindless documentary about this crazy guy who owns a tiger farm. And it's hard because when you watch things that are, or read things that are about the old world, like we found ourselves getting very angry about how much people in the old world before the pandemic took for granted the fact that they could just go outside and talk to each other. So it was very bittersweet because on one hand it was mindless dissociation, but on the other hand it was like a snapshot of the world the way it used to be, where people took for granted that they could just go out and talk to each other. So I'm still trying to find that correct line between engaging with the philosophy of the moment and if there was a better kind of distraction, you know, but it just, I feel like people in everything I watched from before the pandemic, they're just not suffering enough because they don't realize what's to happen. How about you?
Well, I was thinking about different things very far from our. At first, I thought that they were quite far from our conversation, but I realized that in a way they are all related to what we live right now. It's like, well, in such moments, everything gets you back to the things you're living. And for example, I was thinking about a concert. I will send you the link of this concert by a singer, a French singer named Christophe. And he died today of respiratory disease, but everybody knows that it's coronavirus. He died today, and it's a wonderful singer, an old man. He began to write, began by writing very cheesy songs, you know, very songs to dance on the beach. And from time to time, he began really a character in French culture, a dandy, someone very secret, very retired. And he was a beautiful composer, some kind of a French Scott Walker, maybe someone like that. So I had this concert that he gave in Italy in the Villa Médicis, and it's linked to the virus.
Oh, it's I mean, it's funny because like everybody wants to forget, dissociate, imagine themselves in some other time, but everything we're seeing and reading right now is seen through the lens of our moment. And so, you know, engagement is so bittersweet in a way, and either it relates directly to people affected by the virus, or it makes you imagine a time other than the moment we're living in. So it's always a tension between engaging directly and trying to kind of forget, you know, even our dreams right now.
Yeah. Exactly. But that's a nice, that's an interesting way to think, to have to go from far to your subject. You know, I think that we can't understand anything in this moment if we don't take a distance from it. That's complicated, of course.
Wonderful. Listen, I would love to keep speaking. This is very, very lovely to speak with you. I would love to keep talking.
Yeah, that was a real pleasure. Real pleasure. Yeah. So have a nice day. Stay safe.
Same.
And well, be patient and calm.
Yeah. I look forward to meeting in person. I'll buy you a coffee in Brooklyn, or and then we can have a glass of wine in Paris together.
Oh, yeah, I can't wait, but we'll have to wait. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.